First Love and Other Sorrows by Harold Brodkey. Toward the end of March in St. Louis, slush fills the gutters, and dirty snow lies heaped alongside porch steps, and everything seems to be suffocating in the embrace of a season that lasts too long. Radiators hiss mournfully, no one manages to be patient. The wind draws tears from your eyes, the clouds are filled with sadness. Women with scarves around their heads and their feet encased in fur-lined boots pick their way carefully over patches of melting ice. It seems that winter will last forever, that this is the decision of nature and nothing can be done about it. At the age when I was always being warned by my mother not to get overheated, spring began on that evening when I was first allowed to go outside after dinner and play kick the can. The ground would be moist. I'd managed to get muddy in spite of what seemed to me extreme precautions. My mother would call me home in the darkness, and when she saw me she would ask, "What have you done to yourself?" "Nothing," I'd say hopefully. But by the time I was 16, the moment when the year passed into spring, like so many other things, was less clear. In March and early April, track began, but indoors. Mid-term exams came and went. The buds appeared on the maples, staining all their branches red, but it was still winter, and I found myself having feelings in class that were like long petitions for spring and all its works. And then, one evening, I was sitting at my desk doing my trigonometry, and I heard my sister coming home from her office. I heard her high heels tapping on the sidewalk, and realized that for the first time since fall, all the windows in the house were open. My sister was coming up the front walk. I looked down through a web of budding tree branches and called out to her that it was spring, by God. She shrugged. She was very handsome, and she didn't approve of me. And then she started up the front steps and vanished under the roof of the porch. I ran downstairs. "The bus was crowded tonight," my sister said, hanging up her coat. "I could hardly breathe. This is such a warm dress." "You need a new spring dress," my mother said, her face lighting up. She was sitting in the living room with the evening paper on her lap. She and my sister spread the newspaper on the dining room table to look at the ads. "We'll just have to settle for sandwiches tonight," my mother said to me. My father was dead, and my mother pretended that now all the cooking was done for my masculine benefit. "Look, that suit's awfully smart," she cried, peering at the paper. "Montaldo's always has such nice suits." She sighed and went out to the kitchen, leaving the swinging door open so she could talk to my sister. $90 isn't too much for a good suit, do you think?" "No," my sister said, "I don't think it's too much. But I don't really want a suit this spring. I'd much rather have a sort of sky blue dress with a round neck that shows my shoulders a little bit. I don't look good in suits. I'm not old enough." She was 22. "My face is too round," she added in a low voice. My mother said, "You're not too young for a suit." She also meant my sister was not too young to get married. My sister looked at me and said, "Mother, do you think he shaves often enough? How often do you shave?" "Every 3 days," I said, flushing up to my neck and cheeks. "Well, try it every other day." "Yes, try to be neater," my mother said. "I'm sure girls don't like boys with fuzz on their chin." "I think he's too proud of his beard to shave it," my sister said, and giggled. "I feel sorry for the man who marries you," I said, "because everybody thinks you're sweet, and you're not." She smiled pityingly at me, and then she looked down over the newspaper again. Until I was 4, we lived in a large white frame house overlooking the Mississippi River south of St. Louis. This house had, among other riches, a porte cochere, an iron deer on the lawn, and a pond with goldfish swimming in it. Once I asked my mother why we had left that earlier house, and she said, "We lost our money, that's why. Your father was a very trusting man," she said. "He was always getting swindled." She was not a mercenary woman, nor was she mean about money, except in spells that didn't come often. But she believed that what we lost with the money was much of our dignity and much of our happiness. She didn't want to see life in a grain of sand, She wanted to see it from the shores of the Riviera, wearing a white shark-skin dress. I'll never forget her astonishment when she took us, as she was dressed in her best furs, as a gesture, I suppose, to see the house that was to be our home from then on, and I told her I liked it. It had 9 rooms, a stained-glass window in the hall, and neighbours all up and down the block. She detested that house. As she grew older, she changed. She grew less imperious. She put her hair into a roll, wore dark-coloured clothes, and said often, "I'm not a young woman any more," and began to take pride in being practical. But she remained determined. She had seen a world we didn't remember too clearly, and she wanted us to make our way back to it. "I had it all," she said once to my sister. "I was good-looking, we were rich. You have no idea what it was like. If I'd died when I was 30, I would have died completely happy." But being practical did not come easy to her. She was not practical in her bones, and every spring brings back the memory of my mother peering near-sightedly with surprise at the tulip shoots in her flower border. And it brings back her look of distraught efficiency during spring house cleaning. "You better clear your closet shelves tonight," she would warn me, "because tomorrow Tilly and I are going in there with a vacuum cleaner and we'll throw out everything we find." Year after year, I would run upstairs to save my treasures, even when I was 16 and on the verge of a great embarkation, the nature of which I could not even begin to guess. My treasures consisted of my postcard collection, 2,500 cards in all, arranged alphabetically by states of the Union and countries of the world. The wonder was that I lived in St. Louis. An old baseball glove, my Leaf collection, 2 obscene comic books I had won in a poker game at a Boy Scout jamboree, my marble collection, and 35 pages of secret thoughts written out in longhand. All these had to be taken out of the garage and hidden among the tools until the frenzy of cleaning was over, and I could smuggle them back upstairs. After supper, as the season grew warmer, my mother and sister and I would sit on the screened porch in the rear of the house, marooned among the shadows and the new leaves and the odour of insect spray, the light from our lamps sticking to the trees like bits of yellow paper. Usually the radio was on, and my mother, a book on her lap, her face abstracted. She was usually bored. Her life was moved mainly by the burning urge to rise once more along the thin edge of social distinction, would listen to the comedians and laugh. When the phone rang, she would get up and go into the house with long strides, and if the call was for my sister, my mother would call her to the phone in a voice mottled with triumph. Sometimes in the evening, my mother would wash my sister's hair. My sister would sit in front of the basin in mother's bathroom, a towel around her shoulders, smiling. From my room across the hall, I would hear my sister chattering about the men she knew, the ones she dated, the ones she wanted to date, the ones she wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. My mother would interrupt with accounts of her own cleverness, her sorties and successes when young, sometimes laughingly, but sometimes gloomily, because she regretted a lot of things. Then she and my sister would label my sister's suitors. 1 or 2 had family, 1 had money, 1, a poor boy, had a brilliant future, and there were a few docile, sweet ones who were simply fillers, who represented the additional number of dates that raised my sister to the rank of a very popular girl. In these conversations, my mother would often bring up matters of propriety. Late dates were improper. Flirting with boys other than one's date, breaking dates. Then, too, she would try to instruct my sister in other matters, which had to do with keeping passion in its place, and so preventing embarrassment for the boy and disaster for the girl. My sister would grow irritated. "I don't know why you talk like that. I behave very well," she would tell my mother, "better than the other girls I know." Her irritation would please my mother, who would smile and say that only good-looking girls could afford to be good, and then they would both laugh. I used to wonder why my mother didn't take my sister's success for granted. My sister was lovely. She had plenty of dates. The phone rang incessantly. Where was the danger? Why did she always lecture my sister? Once my mother said my sister ought not to dance with too many boys, or she would frighten off the more serious ones. My sister was getting dressed for the spring dance at the country club. Arrogant and slender, she glistened like a water nymph among her froth of bottles and jars and filmy clothes. She became furious. She screamed that she liked to dance. I closed the room to my door, but I could still hear the two of them. "Don't be so foolish," my mother kept saying over and over again. "Please don't be foolish." Then my sister, on the verge of tears, said she just wanted to have a good time. My sister's date arrived, and I went downstairs to let him in. And by the time I came back upstairs, the two of them were laughing. My mother said she was just trying to be helpful. After all, my sister was impractical, and her looks wouldn't last forever. My sister, as she opened the door of her room, said under her breath, "They'll last a lot longer yet." I'll never forget the wild rustling of her voluminous white skirt as she came down the hallway toward me. Her face was strangely still, as if seen by moonlight. Her hair was smooth and shining, her hands bent outward at the wrist as if they were flowers. "How beautiful you look," I cried. My sister smiled and then solemnly turned all the way round, and her huge skirt rose and fell like a splash of surf. She was so beautiful I could hardly bear it. I hugged her and she laughed. Later that night, I asked my mother why she got so distraught. Wasn't my sister popular enough? My mother was sitting in the kitchen in an old, faded yellow housecoat, drinking a glass of warm milk. "You don't know anything about it," she said, with such sadness that I rose from the table and fled to my room. "I know what I'm saying," my mother would cry when she argued with my sister. "You must listen to me. People talk. You don't know who you'll meet on a date. It's good to accept even if you don't like the boy. Girls have to be very careful. You're thoughtless. Don't you think in 50 years I've learned what makes the world go round? Now listen to me. I know what I'm saying." But my sister's face was so radiant. Her charm was so intense. She pushed her blonde hair back from her face with a gesture so quick, so certain, so arrogant and filled with vanity that no one, I thought, could doubt that whatever she did would be right. I wanted to be arrogant too. I didn't want to wear glasses and be one of the humorless, heavy-handed boys my sister despised. I was on her side as much as she let me be. She was the elder, and she often grew impatient with me. I didn't seem to understand all the things involved in being on her side. Night after night, I saw her come home from work tired. She had a secretarial job in a hospital, and she hated it. And 2 hours later, she would descend the stairs to greet her date, her face alight with seriousness or with a large, bright smile, depending on her mood or on where her escort was taking her that evening. A concert or an art movie made her serious. One of the hotel's supper clubs brought a smile to her face. She would trip down the stairs in her high heels, a light, flimsy coat thrown over one arm, one hand clutching a purse and gloves, her other hand on the banister. In the queer yellow light of the hall chandelier, her necklace or her earrings would shine dully, and sometimes, especially if she was all dressed up, in a black dress, say, with a low neck, because they were going out to a supper club, there would be an air, in spite of her gaiety, of the captive about her. It was part of her intense charm. In her voluminous white skirt, she went to the spring dance at the country club, and brought back to my mother the news that she had captured the interest of Sonny Brewster, the oldest son of M.F. Brewster, a banker and a very rich man. More than interest, it turned out, because he started calling my sister up almost every day at work and taking her out almost every night. My mother was on the phone much of the afternoon explaining to her friends that my sister wasn't engaged. It was criminal the way some people gossiped, she said. My sister had only gone out with the boy 10 or 12 times. They were just getting to know one another. Then my mother began to receive calls. Someone had heard from a friend of Mrs. Brewster that Mrs. Brewster had said her son was very serious about my sister, who was a very charming, very pretty girl of good family. My mother rubbed her hands with glee. She borrowed money from her brothers, and every week my sister had new clothes. My sister would come home from work and run upstairs to change. Sonny would be due at 7 and take her out to dinner. My sister would kick her shoes off, struggle out of her dress and dash around the upstairs in her slip. "Mother, I can't find my earrings." "Which earrings, dear?" "The little pearls, the little tiny pearl ones that I got 2 Easters ago to go with my black." My sister was delighted with herself. She loved being talked about, being envied. "Mother, do you know what Cecil Johnson said to me today? She said that Beryl Ferringhouse, you know, the real estate people, was heartbroken because she thought Sonny Brewster was going to get engaged to her." My sister giggled. Her long hair was tangled, and my mother yanked a comb through it. "Maybe you ought to cut your hair," my mother said, trying to hide her own excitement and to stay practical. During this period, my mother was living in the imminence of wealth. Whenever she stopped what she was doing and looked up, her face would be bright with visions. That spring, when I was 16, more than anything else in the world, I wanted to be a success when I grew up. I didn't know there was any other way of being lovable. My best friend was a boy named Preston, who already had a heavy beard. He was shy and unfortunate in his dealings with other people, and he wanted to be a physicist. He had very little imagination, and he pitied anyone who did have it. "You and the word beautiful," he would say disdainfully, holding his nose and imitating my voice. "Tell me, what does beautiful mean?" "It's something you want," I would say. "You're an aesthete," Preston would say. "I'm a scientist, that's the difference." He and I used to call each other almost every night and have long, profound talks on the telephone. On a date, Preston would sit beside his girl and stolidly eye her. Occasionally, toward the end of the evening, he would begin to breathe heavily, and he would make a few laboured, daring jokes. He might catch the girl's hand and stare at her with inflamed and wistful eyes, or he might mutter incoherent compliments. Girls liked him, and escaped easily from his clumsy longing. They slipped their hands from his grasp and asked him to call them up again. But after a few dates with a girl, Preston would say disgustedly, "Oh, she does his talk. She's frigid or something." But the truth was, he was afraid of hurting them, of doing something wrong to them, and he never really courted them at all. At school, Preston and I had afternoon study hall together. Study hall was in the library, which was filled with the breathing of 150 students, and with the dim, half-fainting breezes of high spring, and with books. It was the crossroads of the world. Preston and I would sign out separately and meet in the lavatory. There we would lean up against the stalls and talk. Preston was full of thoughts. He was tormented by all his ideas. "Do you know what relativity means?" he would ask me. "Do you realise how it affects every little detail of everyday life?" Or it might be Spinoza that moved him. 18th century, but by God, there was a rational man. I would pace up and down, half listening, half daydreaming, wishing my name would appear on Preston's lists of people who had elements of greatness. Or we talked about our problems. "I'm not popular," I would say. "I'm too gloomy." "Why is that, do you think?" Preston would ask. "I don't know," I would say. "I'm a virgin." "That has a lot to do with everything." "Listen," Preston said one day, "you might not be popular, but you're likeable. Your trouble is, you're a snob." He walked up and down the white-tiled floor, mimicking me. He slouched and cast his eyes down and jutted his chin out and pulled a foolish, serious look over his face. "Is that me?" I cried, heartbroken. "Well, almost," Preston said. Or, leaning on the windowsill, sticking our heads out into the golden afternoon air and watching the girls' gym class doing archery under the trees, we talked about sex. "It starts in the infant," Preston said, "and it lasts forever." "Saints escape it," I said mournfully. "The hell they do," Preston said. The girls beneath us on the hillside drew their bows. Their thin green gym suits fluttered against their bodies. "Aren't they nice?" Preston asked longingly. "Aren't they wonderful?" After school, Preston and I went out for track. The outdoor track was a cinder oval surrounding the football field. A steep, grassy hill led up to the entrance of the school locker room. "Run up that hill every night, boys," the coach pleaded. Old Mackies, with his paunch and his iron grey wavy hair at the end of the practice period. "Run, boys, because when you're absolutely exhausted, that's when you got to give more. It's the more, boys, that makes champions." And then he'd stand there, humble and touched by his own speech. During our warm-up sessions, we used to jog-trot the length of the field and back again, keeping our knees high. The grand inutility of this movement filled me with something like exultation, and on every side of me, in irregular lines, my fellow males jogged, keeping their knees high. What happiness! "The turf's too springy," Preston would mumble. "Bad for the muscles." Preston was a miler. He was thick-set and without natural grace. Mackies said he had no talent, but he ran doggedly, and he became a good miler. I ran the 440. I was tall and thin, and even Mackies said I ought to be good at it, but I wasn't. Mackies said I didn't have the spirit. "All you smart boys are alike," he said. "You haven't got the heart for it. You always hold back. You're all a bunch of gold bricks." I tried to cure my maimed enthusiasm. As I ran, Mackies would bawl desperately, "Hit the ground harder! Hit it with your toes! Spring, boy, spring! Don't coddle yourself, for God's sake!" After a race, I'd throw myself down on the knoll near the finish line under a sycamore tree, where the track manager dug a new hole every day for us to puke in. 3 or 4 others would join me, and we'd lie there wearily, our chests burning, too weak to move. Among my other problems was that I was reduced nearly to a state of tears over my own looks whenever I looked at a boy named Joel Bush. Joel was so incredibly good-looking that none of the boys could quite bear the fact of his existence. His looks weren't particularly masculine or clean-cut, and he wasn't a fine figure of a boy. He was merely beautiful. He looked like a statue that had been rubbed with honey and warm wax to get a golden tone, and he carried at all times in the neatness of his features and the secret proportions of his face and body that made him so handsome in that particular way, the threat of seduction. "Displease me," he seemed to say, "and I'll get you. I'll make you fall in love with me, and I'll turn you into a donkey." Everyone either avoided him or gave in to him. Teachers refused to catch him cheating, boys never teased him, and no one ever told him off. One day I saw him saying goodbye to a girl after school, and as he left her to join me, walking toward the locker room, he said to her, "Meet you here at 5:30. Track wasn't over until 6, and I could tell that he had no intention of meeting her, and yet, when he asked me about some experiments we had done in physics, instead of treating him like someone who had just behaved like a heel, I told him everything I knew." He never joined us under the sycamore tree, and he ran effortlessly. He would pass the finish line, his chest heaving under his sweat-stained track shirt, and climb into the stands and sit in the sunlight. I was watching him one afternoon as he sat there wiping his face and turning his head from side to side. At one moment it was all silver except for the charred hollows of his eyes, and the next it was young and perfect, the head we all recognised as his. Mackies saw him and called out to him to put his sweatshirt on before he got cold. As he slipped the sweatshirt on, Joel shouted, Go fry your head." Mackies laughed good-naturedly. Sprinkled here and there on the football field were boys lifting their arms high and then sweeping them down to touch their toes, or lying on their backs and bicycling their legs in the air. I got up and walked toward them to do a little jog-trotting and high-knee prancing. I looked at Joel. "I'm cooling off," he said to me. I walked on, and just then a flock of crows wheeled up behind the oak tree on the hill and filled the sky with their vibrant motion. Everyone, even Preston, paused and looked up. The birds rose in a half-circle and then glided, scythe-like, with wings outspread, on a down current of air until they were only 20 feet or so above the ground. Then they flapped their wings with a noise like sheets being shaken out and soared aloft, dragging their shadows up the stepped concrete geometry of the stands, past Joel's handsome, rigid figure, off into the sky. "What do you know about that?" Mackie said. "Biggest flock of crows I ever saw." "Why didn't you get your gun and shoot a couple?" Joel called out. Everyone turned. "Then you'd have some crow handy whenever you had to eat some," Joel said. "Take a lap," Mackie's bawled, his leathery face turning red up to the roots of his iron-grey hair. "He was only kidding," I said, appalled at Mackie's hurt. Mackie's looked at me and scowled. "You can take a lap too, and don't talk so much." I took off my sweatshirt and dropped it on the grass and set off round the track. As soon as I started running, the world changed. The bodies sprawled out across the green of the football field were parts of a scene remembered, not one real at this moment. The whole secret of effort is to keep on, I told myself. Not for the world would I have stopped then. And yet nothing, not even if I had been turned handsome as a reward for finishing, could have made up for the curious pain of the effort. About halfway round the track, Joel caught up to me, and then he slowed down and ran alongside. "Mackie's isn't watching," he said. "Let's sneak up the hill." I looked and saw Mackie's was lining up the team for high jump practice. Joel sailed up over the crest of the hill, and I followed him. "He's getting senile," Joel said, dropping to a sitting position, sighting over the crest of the hill at Mackie's and then lying down. "Come on, jerk, lie down. You want Mackie's to see you?" I was uneasy. This sort of fooling was all right for Joel because he made the effort. But if Mackie's caught me, he'd kick me off the team. I pointed this out to Joel. "Oh, Mackie's takes everything too seriously. That's his problem," Joel said. "He's always up in the air about something. I don't see why he makes so much fuss. You ever notice how old men make a big fuss over everything? Mackie's is not so old. All right, did you ever notice how middle-aged men make a big fuss over everything?" A few seconds later, he said casually, his gaze resting on the underside of the leaves of the oak tree, "I got laid last night." "No kidding," I said. He spread his fingers over his face, no doubt to see them turn orange in the sunlight as children do. "Yeah," he said. From the football field came the sounds of high jump practice starting. Mackie's was shouting, "Now start with your left foot. 1, 2, 3. Take off, God damn it! Spread your goddamn legs, spread 'em. You won't get ruptured. There's sand to catch you, for Christ's sake." The jumper's footsteps made a series of thuds. There was a pause, and then the sound of the landing in the sand. Lifting my head, I could see the line of boys waiting to jump, the lead boy breaking into a run, leaping from the ground and spreading his arms in athletic entreaty. "It was disappointing," Joel said. "How?" I asked. "It's nothing very special." I was aroused by this expose. "You mean the books?" "It's not like that at all." He turned sullenly and scrabbled with his fingers in the dirt. "It's like masturbation, kind of, with bells." "Maybe the girl didn't know how to do it." "She was a grown woman." "Yeah, but she was a fully grown woman. She knew what she was doing." "Oh," I said. Then, after a minute, "Look, would you mind telling me what you said to her? If I ever had the chance, I wouldn't know what to say. I..." "Don't remember," Joel said. "We just looked at each other, and then she got all tearful, and she told me to take my clothes off." We lay there a minute in the late afternoon sunshine, and then I said we'd better be getting back. We walked around behind the hill and waited until Mackie's wasn't looking before we sprinted out onto the track. The jumping went on for 15 or 20 minutes more. Then Mackie's raised his arms in a gesture of benediction. "All right, you squirts, all out onto the track for a fast lap. And that includes you, Goldbrick," he said to me, wagging his finger. All the boys straightened up and started toward the track. The sun's light poured in long, low rays over the roof of the school. Jostling and joking, we started to run. "Faster!" Mackie's yelled. "Faster! What's the matter? You're a bunch of girls! Faster, for Christ's sake, faster!" Since Preston, in his dogged effort to become a good miler, ran 3 laps to everyone else's 1, he was usually the last in the locker room. He would come in worn out and breathing heavily. Sometimes he even had to hold himself up with one hand on his locker while he undressed. Everyone else would long since have showered and would be almost ready to leave. They might make one or two remarks about Preston's running his legs down to stumps or trying to kill himself for Mackie's sake. Preston would smile numbly while he tried to get his breath back, and somehow I was always surprised by how little attention was paid to Preston, how cut off and how alone he was. More often than not, Joel would be showing off in the locker room, walking around on his hands, singing dirty songs, or engaged in some argument or other. Preston would go into the shower. I would talk to Joel, dressing slowly, because I usually waited for Preston. By the time I was all dressed, the locker room would be empty, and Preston would still be toweling himself off. Then, instead of hurrying to put his clothes on, he would run his hand over his chest to curl the few limp hairs. "Oh, come on," I would say disgustedly. "Hold your horses," he would say, with his maddening physicist serenity. "Just you hold your horses." It took him half an hour to get dressed. He'd stand in front of the mirror and flex his muscles endlessly and admire the line his pectorals made across his broad rib cage. And he always left his shirt until last, even till after he had combed his hair. I found his vanity confusing. He was far from handsome, with his heavy mouth and bushy eyebrows and thick, sloping shoulders, but he loved his reflection, and he'd turn and gaze at himself in the mirror from all sorts of angles while he buttoned up his shirt. He hated Joel. "There's a guy who'll never amount to much," Preston would say. "He's chicken, and he's not very smart. I don't see why you want him to like you, except that you're a sucker. You let your eyes run away with your judgment." I put up with all this because I wanted Preston to walk me part way home. It seemed shameful somehow to have to walk home alone. Finally he would finish, and we would emerge from the now deserted school into the dying afternoon. As we walked, Preston harangued me about my lack of standards and judgment. The hunger I had for holding school office and for being well thought of he dismissed as a streak of lousy bourgeois cowardice. I agreed with him. I didn't like myself anyway, but what was to be done about it? "We might run away," Preston said, squinting up at the sky. "Hitchhike, work in factories, go to a whorehouse." I leaned against a tree trunk, and Preston stood with one foot on the curb and one foot in the street, and we lobbed pebbles back and forth. "We're doomed," Preston said. Doom was one of his favourite words, along with culture, kinetic, and the absolute. "We come from a dying culture," he said. "Suppose you're right," I said. "It certainly looks that way." But then I cheered up. "After all, it's not as if we were insane or something." "It wouldn't show yet," Preston said gloomily. "It's still in the latent stage. It'll come out later. You'll see. After all, you're still living at home, and you've got your half-assed charm." I broke in. I had never had a compliment from him before. "I didn't say you were charming," he said. "I say you have half-assed charm. You behave well in public. That's all I meant." At the corner where we separated, Preston stood a moment or two. "It's hopeless," he said. "God, do you really think so?" I asked. "That's my honest opinion," he said. He turned toward his house. I jogged a block or two and then felt my stomach muscles. Then I came to a maple with a low straight branch. I ran and jumped up and swung from the branch, while a big green diesel bus rolled ponderously past, all its windows filled with tired faces that looked out at the street going by and at me hanging from the branch and smiling. I was doomed, but I was very likely charming. I ran in the front door of my house and called out, "Mother, Mother!" "What is it?" she answered. She was sitting on the screened porch, and I could see a little plume of cigarette smoke in the doorway. There was the faint mutter of a radio news programme turned on low. "Nothing," I said. "I'm home, that's all." At the dinner table, I would try to disguise myself by slouching in my chair and thinking about my homework, but my mother and my sister always recognised me. "How was track today?" my sister would ask in a slightly amused way. "Fine," I would say in a low voice. My mother and my sister would exchange glances. I must have seemed comic to them, stilted and slightly absurd, like all males. Almost every evening, Sonny Brewster used to drive up to our house in his yellow convertible. The large car would glide to a stop at the curb, and Sonny would glance quickly at himself in the rearview mirror, running his hand over his hair. Then he'd climb out and brush his pants off, too occupied with his own shyness to notice the children playing on the block. But they would stop what they were doing and watch him. I would wait for him at the front door and let him in and lead him into the living room. I walked ahead of Sonny because I had noticed that he could not keep himself from looking up the stairs as we passed through the hallway, as if to conjure up my sister then and there with the intensity of his longing. And I hated to see him do this. I would sit in the high-backed yellow chair, and Sonny would settle himself on the couch and ask me about track or if I'd picked a college yet. You ought to think carefully about college, he would say. I think Princeton is more civilized than Yale. His gentle, well-bred voice was carefully inexpressive. In his manner there was a touch of stiffness to remind you and himself that he was rich, and if some disrespect was intended for him, he wouldn't necessarily put up with it. But I liked him. He treated me with great politeness, and I liked the idea of his being my brother-in-law, and I sometimes thought of the benefits that would fall to me if my sister married him. Then my sister would appear at the head of the stairs, dressed to go out, and Sonny would leap to his feet. "Are you ready?" he'd cry, as if he had never dared hope she would be. My sister would hand him her coat, and with elaborate care he'd hold it for her. It would be perhaps 8 o'clock or a little after. The street lamps would be on, but looking pallid because it wasn't quite dark. Usually Sonny would open the car door for my sister, but sometimes with a quick manoeuvre she would forestall him. She would hurry the last few steps, open the door and slip inside before he could lift his hand. Sonny was not the first rich boy who had loved my sister. He was the 4th or 5th. And in the other cases there had been scenes between my mother and sister in which my mother extolled the boy's eligibility and my sister argued that she was too young to marry and didn't want to stop having a good time yet. Each time she had won, and each time the boy had been sent packing, while my mother looked heartbroken and said my sister was throwing her chances away. With Sonny the same thing seemed about to happen. My sister missed going out with a lot of boys instead of with just one. She complained once or twice that Sonny was jealous and spoiled. There were times when she seemed to like him very much, but there were other times when she would greet him blankly in the evening when she came downstairs, and he would be apologetic and fearful, and I could see that her disapproval was the thing he feared most in the world. My mother didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she hid her feelings. Then one night I was sitting in my room doing my homework and I heard my mother and sister come upstairs. They went into my sister's room. "I think Sonny's becoming very serious," my mother said. "Sonny's so short," I heard my sister say. "He's not really interesting either, Mother." "He seems very fond of you," my mother said. "He's no fun," my sister said. "Mother, be careful. You're brushing too hard. You're hurting me." I stopped trying to work and listened. "Sonny's a very intelligent boy," my mother said. "He comes from a good family." "I don't care," my sister said. "I don't want to waste myself on him." "Waste yourself?" My mother laughed derisively. I got up and went to the door of my sister's room. My sister was sitting at her dressing table, her hair shining like glass and her eyes closed. My mother was walking back and forth, gesturing with the hairbrush. "He's the one who's throwing himself away," she said. "Who do you think we are, anyway? We're nobodies." "I'm pretty," my sister objected angrily. My mother shrugged. "The woods are full of pretty girls. What's more, they're full of pretty rich girls. Now, Sonny's a very nice boy. Leave me alone." My sister pulled her hair up from her shoulders and held it in a soft mop on the top of her head. "Sonny's a jerk, a jerk." "He's nice looking," my mother cried. "What do you know about it?" my sister cried. "You're old, for God's sake." The air vibrated. My sister rose and looked at my mother, horrified at what she had said. She took her hands from her hair and it fell, tumbling to her shoulders, dry and pale and soft. "I don't care," she said suddenly, and brushed past me and fled into the bathroom and locked the door. There was no further sound from her. The only trace of her in the house at that moment was the faint odour in her room of the flowery perfume she used that spring. "Oh, she's so foolish," my mother said, and I saw that she was crying. "She doesn't know what she's doing. Why is she so foolish?" Then she put the hairbrush down and raised her hands to her cheeks and began to pinch them. I went back to my room and closed the door. When I came out again an hour later, my mother was in bed reading a magazine. She looked as if she had been wounded in a dozen places. My sister sat in her room in front of the mirror. Her hair streamed down the back of her neck and lay in touching, defenceless little curls on the towel she had over her shoulders. She was studying her reflection thoughtfully. Are flowers vain? Are trees? Are they consumed with vanity during the days when they're in bloom? She raised her finger and pressed it against her lower lip to see, I think, if she would be prettier if her lip, instead of being smooth, had a slight break in the centre, as some girls did. Shortly after this, my mother, who was neither stupid nor cruel, suggested that my sister stop seeing Sonny for a while. "Until you make up your mind," she said. "Otherwise you might break his heart, you know. Tell him you need some time to think. He'll understand. He'll think you're grown up and responsible." Sonny vanished from our house. In the evenings now, after dinner, the three of us would sit on the screened porch. My sister would look up eagerly when the phone rang, but the calls were never for her. None of her old boyfriends knew she had stopped dating Sonny, and after a while, when the phone rang, she would compose her face and pretend she wasn't interested, or she would say irritably, "Who can that be?" She began to answer the phone herself. She never had before, because it wasn't good for a girl to seem too eager. And she would look sadly at herself in the hall mirror while she said, "Yes, Preston, he's here." She tried to read. She'd skim a few pages and then put the book down and gaze out through the screens at the night and the patches of light on the trees. She would listen with my mother to the comedians on the radio and laugh vaguely when my mother laughed. She picked on me. "Your posture's no good," she'd say, or "Where do you learn your manners? Mother, he behaves like a zoot-suiter or something." Another time she said, "If I don't make a good marriage, you'll be in trouble. You're too lazy to do anything on your own." She grew more and more restless. Toying with her necklace, she broke the string, and the beads rolled all over the floor, and there was something frantic in the way she went about retrieving the small rolling bits of glitter. It occurred to me that she didn't know what she was doing. She was not really as sure of everything as she seemed. It was a painfully difficult thought to arrive at, and it clung to me. Why hadn't I realised it before? Also, she sort of hated me, it seemed to me. I'd never noticed that before either. How could I have been so wrong, I wondered. Knowing how wrong I had been about this, I felt that no idea I had ever held was safe. For instance, we were not necessarily a happy family with the most wonderful destinies waiting for my sister and me. We might make mistakes and choose wrong. Unhappiness was real. It was even likely. How tired I became of studying my sister's face. I got so I would do anything to keep from joining the two women on the porch. After 3 weeks of this, Sonny returned. I was never told whether he came of his own accord or whether he was summoned, but one night the yellow convertible drove up in front of our house and he was back. Now when my mother would watch my sister and Sonny getting to Sonny's car in the evenings, she would turn away from the window smiling. "I think your sister has found a boy she can respect," she would say, or "They'll be very happy together," or some such hopeful observation which I could see no basis for, but which my mother believed with all the years and memories at her disposal, with all the weight of her past and her love for my sister, and I would go and call Preston. I used to lie under the dining-room table, sheltered and private like that, looking up at the way the pieces of mahogany were joined together while we talked. I would cup the telephone to my ear with my shoulder and hold my textbook up in the air over my head as we went over physics, which was a hard subject for me. "Preston," I asked one night, "what in God's name makes a siphon work?" They did work, everyone knew that, and I groaned as I asked it. Preston explained the theory to me, and I frowned, breathed heavily through my nose, squinted at the incomprehensible diagrams in the book, and thought of sex, of the dignity of man and the wonders of the mind as he talked. Every few minutes he asked me, "Do you see?" And I would sigh. It was spring, and there was meaning all around me. If only I were free. Free of school, free of my mother, free of duties and inhibitions. If only I were mounted on a horse. Where was the world? Not here. Not near me. Not under the dining room table. Not quite, I'd say, untruthfully, afraid that I might discourage him. But I almost get it. Just tell me once more. And on he went, while I frowned, breathed hard, and squinted. And then it happened. "I see," I cried. I see. It was air pressure. How in the world had I failed to visualize air pressure? I could see it now. I would never again not see it. It was there in my mind, solid and indestructible, a whitish column sitting on the water. "God damn it, science is wonderful," I said, and heaved my physics book into the living room. "Really wonderful." "It's natural law," Preston said reprovingly. "Don't get emotion mixed up with it." One evening, when my sister and Sonny didn't have a date to go out, my mother tapped lightly on my foot, which protruded from under the dining room table. "I have a feeling Sonny may call," she whispered. I told Preston I had to hang up and crawled out from beneath the table. "I have a feeling that they're getting to the point," my mother said. "Your sister's nervous." I put the phone back on the telephone table. "But, Mother," I said. And the phone rang. "Shh," she said. The phone rang 3 times. My sister on the extension upstairs said, "Hello, oh, Sonny." My mother looked at me and smiled. Then she pulled at my sleeve until I bent my head down, and she whispered in my ear, "They'll be so happy." She went into the hall to the foot of the stairs. "Tell him he can come over," she whispered passionately. "Sure," my sister was saying on the phone. "I'd like that, if you want. Sure." My mother went on listening, her head tilted to one side, the light falling on her aging face, and then she began to pantomime the answers my sister ought to be making. Sweet yeses, dignified noes, and little bursts of alluring laughter. I plunged down the hall and out the screen door. The street lamps were on, and there was a moon. I could hear the children. "I see Digger, 1, 2, 3, you're caught, Digger." 2 blocks away, the clock on the Presbyterian church was striking the hour. Just then, a little girl left her hiding place in our hedge and ran shrieking for the tree trunk that was her home-free base. I'm home safe, everybody free." All the prisoners, who had been sitting disconsolately on the bumpers of Mr. Calmgut's Oldsmobile, jumped up with joyful cries and scattered abruptly into the darkness. I lifted my face, that exasperating factor, my face, and stared entranced at the night, at the waving tops of the trees and the branches blowing back and forth, and the round moon embedded in the night sky, turning the nearby streamers of cloud into mother of pearl. It was all very rare and eternal seeming. What a dreadful unhappiness I felt. I walked along the curb, balancing with my arms outspread. Leaves hung over the sidewalk. The air was filled with their rustling, and they caught the light of the street lamps. I looked into the lighted houses. There was Mrs. Cairns tucked girlishly into a corner of the living-room couch reading a book. Next door, through the leaves of a tall plant, I saw the Lewises all standing in the middle of the floor. When I reached the corner, I put one arm around the post that held the street sign and leaned there above the sewer grating, where my friends and I had lost perhaps 100 tennis balls over the years. In numberless dusks, we had abandoned our games of catch and handball and gathered around the grating and stared into it at our ball floating down in the darkness. The Cullens' porch light was on in the next block, and I saw Mr. and Mrs. Cullen getting into their car. Eleanor Cullen was in my class at school, and she had been dating Joel. Her parents were going out, and that meant she'd be home alone, if she was home. She might have gone to the library, I thought, as the car started up, or to a sorority meeting. While I stood there looking at the Cullens' house, the porch light went off. A minute later, out of breath from running, I stood on the dark porch and rang the doorbell. There was no light on in the front hall, but the front door was open and I could hear someone coming. It was Eleanor. "Who is it?" she asked. "Me," I said. "Are you busy? Would you like to come out for a little while and talk?" She drifted closer to the screen door and pressed her nose against it. She looked pale without makeup. "Sure," she said. "I'll have to go and put my shoes on. I'm not in a good mood or anything." "That's all right," I said. "Neither am I. I just want to talk to somebody." While I waited for Eleanor to come out, Matty Seaton appeared, striding along the sidewalk. He was on the track team. "Hey, Matty," I called out to him. "Hi," he said. "What's new?" "Nothing much," he said. "You got your trig done?" "Nah, not yet." "You gone with her?" he asked, pointing to the house. "Nah," I said. "Well, I've got to get my homework done," he said. "See you later," I called after him. I knew where he was going. Nancy Ellis's house, 2 blocks down. "Who was that?" Eleanor asked. She stepped out on the porch. She had combed her hair and put on lipstick. "Matty Seaton," I said. "He's pinned to Nancy," Eleanor said. "He likes her a lot." She sat down in a white metal chair. I sat on the porch railing facing her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. "You want a cigarette?" she asked. "Nah, I'm training." We looked at each other, and then she looked away, and I looked down at my shoes. I sat there, liking her more and more. "How come you're in a bad mood?" I asked her. "Me? Oh, I don't know. How did you know I was in a bad mood?" "You told me." I could barely make out her face and the dull colour of her hands in the darkness. "You know, I think I'm not basically a happy person," Eleanor said suddenly. "I always thought I was. People expect you to be, especially if you're a girl." "Doesn't surprise me," I said. A breeze set all the leaves in motion again. "It's going to rain," I said. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her yellow skirt, and threw her cigarette off the porch. The glowing tip landed on the grass. She realized I was staring at her. She lifted her hand and pressed it against her hair. "You may have noticed I look unusually plain tonight," she said. She leaned over the porch railing beside me, supporting herself on her hands. "I was trying to do my geometry," she said in a low voice. "I couldn't do it. I felt stupid," she said, "so I cried. That's why I look so awful." "I think you look all right," I said. I think you look fine." I leaned forward and laid my cheek on her shoulder. Then I sat up quickly, flushing. "I didn't like to hear you being so dissatisfied with yourself," I mumbled. "You could undermine your self-confidence that way." Eleanor straightened up and faced me in the moonlight. "You're beautiful," I burst out longingly. "I never noticed before, but you are." "Wait," Eleanor said. Tears gathered in her eyes. "Don't like me yet. I have to tell you something first. It's about Joel." "You don't have to tell me," I said. "I know you're going with him. I understand." "Listen to me," she said impatiently, stamping her foot. "I'm not going with him. She suddenly pressed her hands against her eyes. "Oh, it's awful," she cried. A little shudder of interest passed through me. "Okay," I said, "but I don't care if you don't tell me." "I want to," she cried. "I'm just a little embarrassed. I'll be right in a minute." "We went out Sunday night," she began, after a few seconds. They had gone to Medart's in Clayton for a hamburger. Joel had talked her into drinking a bottle of beer, and it had made her so drowsy that she'd put her head on the back of the seat and closed her eyes. "What kind of car does Joel have?" I asked. "A Buick," Eleanor said, surprised at my question. "Ah, I see," I said. I pictured the dashboard of a Buick and Joel's handsome face, and then, daringly, I added Eleanor's hand, with its bitten fingernails, holding Joel's hand. I was only half listening because I felt the preliminary stirrings of an envy so deep it would make me miserable for weeks. I looked up at the sky over my shoulder. Clouds had blotted out the moon, and everything had got darker. From the next block, in the sudden stillness, I heard the children shouting, uttering their Babylonian cries as they played Kick the Can. Their voices were growing tired and fretful. And then I felt his hand on my... Eleanor, half drowned in shadow, was showing me, on her breast, where Joel had touched her. Is that all? I said, suddenly smiling. Now I would not have to die of envy. That's nothing. I slapped his face, she exclaimed. Her lip trembled. Oh, I didn't mean, I sort of wanted. Oh, it's all so terrible, she burst out. She ran down the front steps and onto the lawn and leaned against the trunk of an oak tree. I followed her. The pre-storm stillness filled the sky, the air between the trees, the dark spaces among the shrubbery. Oh, God, Eleanor cried, how I hate everything! My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. I hadn't known I could feel like this, that I could pause on the edge of such feeling which lay stretched like an enormous meadow all in shadow inside me. It seemed to me a miracle that human beings could be so elaborate. Listen, Eleanor, I said, you're all right. I've always liked you. I swallowed and moved closer to her. There were 2 moist streaks running down her face. I raised my arm and with the sleeve of my shirt I wiped away her tears. I think you're wonderful. I think you're really something. You look down on me, she said. I know you do, I can tell. How can I, Eleanor? How can I? I cried. I'm nobody. I've been damaged by my heredity. You too, she exclaimed happily. Oh, that's what's wrong with me. A sudden hiss swept through the air, and then the first raindrops struck the street. Quick, Eleanor cried, and we ran up on her porch. 2 bursts of lightning lit up the sky, and the rain streamed down. I held Eleanor's hand, and we stood watching the rain. It's a real thunder shower, she said. Do you feel bad because we've only started being friends tonight? I mean, do you feel you're on the rebound and settling on the second best? I asked. There was a long silence, and all around it was the sound of the rain. I don't think so, Eleanor said at last. How about you? I raised my eyebrows and said, Oh, no, it doesn't bother me at all. That's good, she said. We were standing very close to one another. We talked industriously. I don't like geometry, Eleanor said. I don't see what use it is. It's supposed to train your mind, but I don't believe it. I took my glasses off. Eleanor, I said. I kissed her, passionately, and then I turned away, pounding my fists on top of each other. Excuse me, I whispered hoarsely. That kiss had lasted a long time, and I thought I would die. Eleanor was watching the long slanting lines of rain falling just outside the porch, grey in the darkness. She was breathing very rapidly. You know what? She said. I could make you scrambled eggs. I'm a good cook. I leaned my head against the brick wall of the house and said I'd like some. In the kitchen, she put on an apron and bustled about, rattling pans and silverware and talking in spurts. I think a girl should know how to cook, don't you? She let me break the eggs into a bowl, 3 eggs, which I cracked with a flourish. Oh, you're good at it, she said, and began to beat them with a fork while I sat on the kitchen table and watched her. Do you know that most eggs aren't baby chickens? She asked me. She passed so close to me on her way to the stove that because her cheeks were flushed and her eyes bright, I couldn't help leaning forward and kissing her. She turned pink and hurried to the stove. I sat on the kitchen table, swinging my legs and smiling to myself. Suddenly we heard a noise just outside the back door. I leaped off the table and took up a polite position by the sink. Eleanor froze. But no one opened the door. No one appeared. Maybe it was a branch falling, I said. Eleanor nodded. Then she made a face and looked down at her hands. I don't know why we get so nervous. We aren't doing anything wrong. It's the way they look at you, I said. Yes, that's it, she said. You know, I think my parents are ashamed of me. But someday I'll show them. I'll do something wonderful, and they'll be amazed. She went back to the stove. When are your parents coming home? I asked. They went to a double feature. They can't possibly be out before 11. They might walk out on it, I said. Oh no, Eleanor said, not if they pay for it. We ate our scrambled eggs and washed the dishes and watched the rain from the dining room windows without turning the light on. We kissed for a while, and then we both grew restless and uncomfortable. Her lips were swollen, and she went into the kitchen, and I heard her running the water. When she returned, her hair was combed, and she had put on fresh lipstick. "I don't like being in the house," she said, and led me out on the porch. We stood with our arms around each other. The rain was slackening. "Goodbye, rain," Eleanor said sadly. It was as if we were watching a curtain slowly being lifted from around the house. The trees gleamed wetly near the street lamps. When I started home, the rain had stopped. Water dripped on the leaves of the trees. Little plumes of mist hung over the wet macadam of the street. I walked very gently in order not to disturb anything. I didn't want to run into anybody, and so I went home the back way, through the alley. At the entrance to the alley was a tall cast-iron pseudo-Victorian lamp-post with an urn-shaped head and panes of frosted glass. The milky light it shed trickled part way down the alley, illuminating a few curiously still garage fronts, and here and there the wet leaves of the bushes and vines that bordered the backyards and spilled in such profusion over the fences, hiding the ash pits and making the alley so pretty a place in spring. When I was younger, I had climbed on those ash pits, those brick squares nearly smothered under the intricacies of growing things, and I had searched in the debris for old broken mirrors, discarded scarves with fringes, bits of torn decorated wrapping paper and such treasures. But now I drifted down the alley, walking absently on the wet asphalt. I was having a sort of daydream where I was lying with my head on Eleanor's shoulder, which was bare, and I could hear the slow, even sound of her breathing, the very centre where no light reached, and in my daydream I turned over and kissed Eleanor's hands, her throat. And then I broke into a sprint down the alley, slipping and sliding on the puddles and wet places. I came out the other end of the alley and stood underneath the lamppost. I was breathing with difficulty. Across the street from me, 2 women stood, one on the sidewalk, the other on the front steps of a house, hugging her arms. "It's not a bad pain," the woman on the sidewalk said, "but it persists." My dear," said the other, "don't take any chances, not at our age." And the couple, a boy and a girl, were walking up the street, coming home from the Tivoli Theatre. The girl was slouching in order not to seem taller than the boy, who was very short and who sprang up and down on the balls of his feet as he walked. I picked a spray of lilac and smelled it, but then I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't want to throw it away, and finally I put it in my pants pocket. I vaulted our back fence and landed in our backyard, frightening a cat who leaped out of the hedge and ran in zigzags across the dark lawn. It startled me so much I felt weak. I tucked my shirt in carefully and smoothed my hair. Suddenly I looked down at my fingertips. They were blurred in the darkness and moist from the lilac. I swept them to my mouth and kissed them. The kitchen was dark. There was no sound in the house, no sound at all, and a tremor passed through me. I turned the kitchen light on and hurriedly examined myself for marks of what had happened to me. I peered at my shirt, my pants. I rubbed my face with both hands. Then I turned the light off and slipped into the dining room, which was dark too, and so was the hallway. The porch light was on. I ran up the front stairs and stopped short at the top. There was a light on in my mother's room. She was sitting up in bed with pillows at her back, a magazine across her lap, and a pad of paper on the magazine. "Hello," I said. I expected her to bawl me out for being late, but she just looked at me solemnly for a moment, and then she said, "Sonny proposed to your sister." Because I hadn't had a chance to wash my face, I raised one hand and held it over my cheek and chin to hide whatever traces of lipstick there might be. She said, "They're going to be married in June. They went over to the Brusters to get the ring. He proposed practically the first thing when he came. They were both so happy," she said. "They make such a lovely couple. Oh, if you could have seen them." She was in a very emotional state. I started to back out the door. "Where are you going?" my mother asked. "To bed," I said, surprised. "I'm in training." "Oh, you ought to wait up for your sister." "I'll leave her a note," I said. I went to my room and took the white lilac out of my pocket and put it on my desk. I wrote, "I heard the news and I think it's swell. Congratulations. Wake me up when you come in." I stuck the note in the mirror of her dressing table. Then I went to my room and got undressed. Usually I slept raw, but I decided I'd better wear pyjamas if my sister was going to come in and wake me up. I don't know how much later it was that I heard a noise and sat bolt upright in bed. I had been asleep. My sister was standing in the door of my room. She was wearing a blue dress that had little white buttons all the way down the front, and she had white gloves on. "Are you awake?" she whispered. "Yes," I said. "Where's Mother?" "Downstairs," my sister said, coming into the room, "sending telegrams. Do you want to see my ring?" She took her gloves off. I turned the bedside lamp on and she held her hand out. The ring was gold, and there was an emerald and 4 diamonds around it. "It was his grandmother's," my sister said. I nodded. "It's not what she said, and sat down on the edge of the bed and forgot to finish her sentence. "Tell me," she said, "do you think he's really rich?" Then she turned a sad gaze on me through her lashes. "Do you want to know something awful? I don't like my ring." "Are you unhappy?" I asked. "No, just upset. It's scary getting married. You have no idea. I kept getting chills all evening. I may get pneumonia. Do you have a cigarette?" I said I'd get her one downstairs. "No, there's some in my room," she said. "I'll get them. You know, Sonny and I talked about you. We're going to send you to college and everything. We planned it all out tonight." She played with her gloves for a while, and then she said, looking at the toes of her shoes, "I'm scared. What if Sonny's not good at business?" She turned at me. "You know what I mean? He's so young." "You don't have to marry him," I said. "After all, "You don't understand," my sister said hurriedly, warding off advice she didn't want. "We're too young yet," she laughed. "You know what he said to me?" Just then my mother called out from the bottom of the stairs. "Listen, how does this sound to you? Dear Greta, it's a night letter and we get a lot of words, and I thought Greta would like it better if I started that way. Greta's so touchy, you know. Can you hear me?" "I have to go," my sister whispered. She looked at me, and then suddenly she leaned over and kissed me on the forehead. "Go to sleep," she said. "Have nice dreams." She got up and went out into the hall. "Dodie got engaged tonight," my mother read. "Is got engaged the right way to say it?" Became engaged," my sister said in a distant voice. I put on my bathrobe and slippers and went out into the hall. My sister was leaning over the banister, talking to my mother at the bottom of the stairs about the night letter. I slipped past her and down the back stairs and into the kitchen. I found a cold chicken in the icebox, put the platter on the kitchen table and tore off a leg and began to eat. The door to the back stairs swung open and my sister appeared. "I'm hungry too," she said. "I don't know why." She drifted over to the table and bent over the chicken. "I guess emotion makes people hungry." My mother pushed open the swinging door from the dining room side. "There you are," she said, looking flustered. "I'll have to think some more, and then I'll write the whole thing over," she said to my sister. To me, she said, "Are you eating at this time of night?" My sister said that she was hungry too. "There's some soup," my mother said. "Why don't I heat it up?" And suddenly her eyes filled with tears, and all at once we fell to kissing one another, to embracing and smiling and making cheerful predictions about one another, there in the white, brightly lighted kitchen. We had known each other for so long, and there were so many things that we all 3 remembered. Our smiles, our approving glances wandered from face to face. There was a feeling of politeness in the air. We were behaving the way we would in railway stations, at my sister's wedding, at the birth of her first child, at my graduation from college. This was the first of our reunions.